We're so glad to see all of you here. Every seat is filled and there's tension in the room and anticipation. So that's the best way to start a dinner. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And this dinner is part of Providence, a journal of Christianity, American Foreign Policy, uh, centered around and organized by Dr. Paul Miller, who has arranged for funding for this dinner from an unnamed donor to whom we give our appreciation. And before we begin, I want to mention that we have at least, I believe, 5 people in the room who served in Afghanistan. Would you mind raising your hand if you don't mind? I know you're, yes, thank you. This event is being broadcast live through IRD and Providence Facebook, and the video will be online afterwards. So during the conversation and questions afterwards, be aware that it is being broadcast live. And Paul Miller will be engaging in conversation with Mike Nelson of the University of Pennsylvania, which Providence has also been delighted to publish his commentary of late. And you all will speak for about 45 minutes. Is that my understanding? And then time for questions and comments afterwards. I'm sorry the room is rather tight, so if you need to step away, of course, if you need to, you need to. But please don't do it if not necessary. It might be a little bit disruptive to the camera. But otherwise, Paul and Mike, thank you so much. And Paul, to you next.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conversation with Dr. Miller. I, prior to tonight, had not had the honor of meeting Dr. Miller, although I have read his work before. But we have a couple things in common. We are, as referenced, both contributing editors at Providence Magazine. We're both contributing writers at The Dispatch. But for tonight's conversation, probably the most important distinction we share is that we are, as was mentioned, both veterans of America's longest war and our most recent defeat. And that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get to the conversation about the book, the great book, I would like to introduce Dr. Miller. So as I mentioned, he is a veteran of the Afghan war, and he has the unique distinction of having been a veteran throughout the longitude of the war, but also in various capacities. He served as a U.S. Army officer in 2002 with Task Force 180, or CJTF 180, excuse me. He served as a civilian within the intelligence community for much of the first decade of the war. And then he served as a director at the National Security Council for Afghanistan and Pakistan, seeing the direction of the war across multiple years. He is also, he is currently a professor of the practice at International Affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He serves as the co-chair of Global Politics and Security Concentration in the the School of Foreign Service. And he is also the General Hugh Shelton Visiting Chair in Ethics at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College Foundation at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In addition to Choosing Defeat, the book we're going to talk about tonight, he is also the author of The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism, Just War and Ordered Liberty, American Power and Liberal Order, and Armed State Building. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Miller for his opening comments.
And my opening comments are really just acknowledgments. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction. And it's good to meet you, and I'm looking forward to our talk. I do want to offer some acknowledgments and some thank yous as you continue to eat. This is a bit of an Oscar acceptance speech where I have to say thank you to everyone. So for me and for those who are thanked, it's very meaningful. The rest of you just to continue eating. But I have to thank the Smith Richardson Foundation and the Sarah Skate Foundation for their generous funding. When you write a 500-page book over 5 years, you don't do that without a lot of help and a lot of funding. So the foundations were essential to make that happen. Thank you as well to IRD, to Mark Tooley, to Providence Magazine for hosting this and for being a good friend and partner for a decade plus. I can't remember when we actually met, but for as long as I've known you, you've given me opportunities to write, to publish, to network, and to fellowship. So I appreciate IRD and Mark Tooley. I want to thank, I had 8 research assistants over the years that it took to write this book. And one of them, Angie, is here. So Angie, thank you. And through you, all the research assistants who helped. So thank you for your help with this. Yes. I have 2 of my Georgetown students here. Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Mitch Shivers, are you here? No? Okay. This book wouldn't exist without the 60 or 70 people I interviewed for the book. Ambassador Wayne is one of them. It takes a lot of, I think, courage and humility to sit for an on-the-record interview as we kind of unpack what went wrong and what went right over 20 years. And so I appreciate your help with that and the help with everybody who helped assemble this big narrative. So thank you for that. Thank you, Corey, for blurbing the book in the back there. Appreciate that. Yeah. And thank you to my wife, Jenny, who I had to live with this war, but she had to live with me. So thank you for your patience and for your kindness throughout this long process. Those are my thank yous. Yeah.
Well, then, without further ado, we will get into discussing Dr. Miller's great book. I'm going to start with a series of pretty expansive questions with a pretty expansive topic. So first of all, why this book? Why was this important to write?
Yeah, so there's a personal answer and there's the professional answer to that, right? Personally, I think I knew I was going to write this book almost right away. On 9/12, I thought someday I'm going to write a book about this, whatever this turns out to be. And then as my own involvement in it grew, as I served there with the Army and then studied it with the intelligence community and then served in the NSC, I thought clearly this is something I have to write just as almost a memoir, but I also need to understand it. As I was living it, I didn't understand it. I was doing the best I could, but I wanted to understand it the best I could. And so I knew as the years went by, I'd want to digest this. I purposely waited. I wrote 4 other books first because I wanted to have breadth as a scholar, but I knew that someday I'd come to this and try to understand it with distance, perspective, and breadth. I do hope as a scholar that it's a contribution on IR and American foreign policy and even the psychology of foreign policy making. I hope that's a distinctive contribution. I hope it's a help as well to the Afghanistan War Commission. I think we have one of the commissioners here. Thank you for being here. By and large, I wrote this because I knew that we have to learn something from this. I wrote this as a way to honor the Afghans and the veterans and everyone who served there. I wrote this as a public service. I wrote this as a way for everyone to try to get something. If we don't learn something, then it really will have been in vain. But if at least we learn something from this, then it will not have been completely in vain, and we can go forward in the knowledge that we're more well equipped in the future for the next foreign policy challenge.
So, to the topic of the book itself, which I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers from the name itself. We lost the war in Afghanistan. Why did we lose the war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, y'all might need to get a second serving as I take a deep breath for that. I mean, the full answer is the 500-page book. And so I'm not going to, I could do a public reading and we'll be here until, next week if I read the whole book. I could give you the policy answer and go through each of the 4 administrations. I think the Bush administration erred by having a light footprint and invading Iraq, and the Obama administration erred by having a withdrawal deadline on the troops and dumping too much money too quickly, and the Trump administration erred by negotiating with the Taliban while withdrawing troops, and the Biden administration erred by getting out. So we could walk through all of those, and I could give you a dissertation length on each of those. But then there's the question, why did 4 administrations from different political parties and different persuasions and different temperaments consistently make the wrong choices? Why is there something kind of ingrained almost in American strategic thinking or strategic culture? And I sort of speculate in the opening chapter of the book that if there's an overarching explanation, it may be with the way that we tend to think about our role in the world and our interests in the world in the post-Cold War era, that we tend to define our interests in a very narrow, selfish, self-referential, kind of myopic way. Some of you here know IRD is very big on Christian realism and the thinker Reinhold Niebuhr. He's got this passage in one of his essays that is fantastic, where he kind of criticizes what he calls the myopic, quote, realism, and he puts it in quotes, the realism of those who define their interests so narrowly that it's self-defeating. It becomes unrealistic because we defeat ourselves by how narrow and blinkered we become in how we define our interests. We live in a community of nations. Just like in any neighborhood, you should be aware of how your actions affect the people in the neighborhood. We as a country should be aware of how our actions affect everyone in every nation around us. And I think we didn't do that. I think in Afghanistan, we were so laser focused on killing the next terrorist, which of course was not unjust for us to do. Of course, it was just for us to go and do counterterrorism operations. But we were so focused on that one singular kind of short-term myopic goal that we were unaware, we made ourselves blind to how our presence distorted the environment and made things worse and made it harder for us to actually defeat terrorism, defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So if there's one overarching explanation, it's the patterns of thought that lead us to a self-interested notion of our national interests.
You mentioned two things in there that I'm going to want to come back to, kind of American conception of victory and specifically decisive victory. And you mentioned Chris Kalenda talking about how that was a skewed view at one point in time in your book. You also, I'm going to get into this a little bit later, you alluded to just now what was, I think, correctly characterized with John Brennan's kind of three concentric circles of the goals. And so we'll come back to that. But you mentioned the four administrations that all took different approaches, all incorrectly. This is potentially a little bit of a loaded question, but this war and our loss has become a little bit of a political football. So I want to ask you the loaded question: who lost the war in Afghanistan?
So I gave you why I lost and have who lost. And, from my first answer, you won't be surprised when I point the fingers in every direction, right? The Trump administration and the Biden administration have spent a lot of time and energy pointing the finger at each other. And I just look at that and say, they're both right. And it's also incomplete because the blame goes everywhere. Who lost Afghanistan? I think sort of we all did, right? And at the most fundamental level, the American people did, in a sense, by 2 decades of sort of neglect and passivity. Would it be helpful for me to go through individual actors to answer that, or
I think there's going to be a lot here that we can pull the threads on. One of the things, there was a lot of conversation in your book about the short-term implementation of different. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me offer this because I do sometimes get the question, essentially, which president to blame the most. Who can I blame? People want to have someone to blame, and I think it is appropriate to blame the four presidents, as the buck stops with them. They made the chief decisions. But I actually dislike the question, who do I blame the most? Because it presumes that there's a unit of blame that you can count up, and Bush gets 7 units and Obama gets 8.5, right? We don't have that. That's not how history works. I think it's fair to ask, who am I most disappointed in? And in a sense, I am most disappointed in President Obama because I had the most hope for what he could have achieved given his time in office. He actually presided over the war for longer than anyone, and he came into office with, I think, the right ideas, the right rhetoric, and I think the gap was maybe the largest for his administration. That's not to say I blame him the most or that he lost the war at all. I think there's some other decisions that actually maybe were more consequential. Maybe Trump administration's decisions really, made things irreversible. But that is one way of answering the question. I don't like saying who to blame the most, but maybe who I'm most disappointed in.
In addition to the like I said, the political football of upon whom to place the most blame, we've also seen a certain calcification in the conversation about what people think are the concrete lessons, why we failed, that is different than what you lay out in the book. What would you say to the people who are largely spreading two theories of defeat, I guess? Number one, that we shouldn't fight these kinds of wars, that we can choose whether or not to do counterinsurgency and nation-building type conflicts. And the second one, the lesson that we just weren't lethal enough, that if we had had less restricted rules of engagement, or if we had been more liberal in our targeting engagement criteria, that things would have turned differently and that tactical victories would have resulted in strategic success.
Yeah, but both of these criticisms will be familiar for anybody who's ever read any book on Vietnam, right? So look, I spent the last 2 days over at the Modern War Institute, where they held a 2-day conference on the lessons of Afghanistan. And first of all, it's very encouraging to see that there are still people who show up to a 2-day conference about Afghanistan. But it was noteworthy that in that conference, all of us Afghan scholars there do not agree on everything. And some of these ideas did come up on some of the panels. So it made for a lively debate. On the first criticism, we shouldn't fight these kinds of wars, I'll just give you a version of Trotsky's old aphorism. Trotsky said, "You may not be interested in war, but war may be interested in you. You don't really get a choice whether or not to fight if somebody's going to attack you." In the same way, we may not be interested in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, but terrorists and insurgents might be interested in us, and I think they still are. I know the headlines now are focused on everywhere else, on Iran and on Gaza and on Ukraine. But I know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are definitely still out there. So terrorists and insurgents may still be interested in us. And in order to counter them, we have to have an answer. We have to have tools. We have to have a strategy for opposing those who would wish us harm. And so that's my answer on that one. As for the other criticism, or the other school of thought that we should have just killed more people, how do I put this politely? That was essentially our strategy for much of the first 5 years, was just sort of kill as many terrorists as possible. It was also our strategy for most of the last 10 years, was just kill as many terrorists as possible. There was only a brief period of time in those 20 years when I think we made a serious effort at a more comprehensive counterinsurgency nation-building approach. So if you like what we accomplished in those first 5 years, then you're going to love just killing lots and lots of terrorists. In my view, all that accomplished was a pile of dead terrorists and a failed state in Afghanistan in which the Taliban were able to come back and launch their insurgency. But I can respond more broadly that wars don't. The end of a war is the peace you're trying to build, and I'm saying this both strategically and ethically. Right? I'm speaking out of two schools of thought at the same time. You fight a war because you need to achieve a better peace. That's Augustine. And the killing is incidental. In effect, you should want to win a war without killing anybody. That would be the ideal way to win a war. Is the killing is not the point. So if we could fight a war without killing anybody, that's the right way to fight it. So those who say we should have just killed more, I think they maybe misunderstand the point of war. Obviously, the killing is the regrettably necessary means of war, and it is regrettable. But I don't buy it that we didn't kill enough. I don't think the Afghans believed that either. So I disagree with that.
This actually, I'm going to skip ahead to something that I'd mentioned earlier, but this is a good segue. You quote former CIA Director John Brennan talking about the approach that put 3 concentric circles, that CT was at the center as kind of the one that got the most amount of attention, counterinsurgency outside of that, and then nation building outside of that, which seemed to me as I was reading it, something that struck me throughout my time in Afghanistan, that it was exactly inverted, that CT had disruptive effects, counter leadership targeting had disruptive effects that would fade as soon as the gunshots faded, but that the creating the environment that would be stable was the ultimate goal. But throughout successive nine strategic reviews, it appears it never got that level of attention. It never got that level of focus. Why do you feel that was?
Because we humans are naturally inclined to focus on what is easily conceptualizable, what is countable, what is clear to our minds. We just won't spend time on things that are kind of vague and fuzzy and hard to define, the bigger mysteries, right? And bureaucracies especially focus like a laser on the solvable problem. And it's a solvable problem? That guy on the hill that I want to shoot, right? That's a solvable problem. We know how to do it, and we've built the world's best terrorist-killing machine in world history. What we haven't done is build the world's best nation-building machine in history, because we don't know how to do that yet. And so that's such a fuzzy, hard-to-define problem that we naturally don't spend time on it, and therefore we don't make as much progress on it. It's a series of cognitive biases that I think Americans are especially prone to.
So there seems to me that there's this natural, ironic disconnect in the nature of the war. You talk several times about how people were seeking short-term goals. There were the 9 strategic reviews. There were all sorts of new strategic initiatives that had short-term timelines on them and goals that were set for them. Yet this resulted in the longest war in American history. A lot of people have pointed out that it wasn't one 20-year war, that it was 21-year wars. Do you feel if there had been a you quote, I believe it was General McChrystal you quote, talking about the nature of the way that the enemy looked at it, which is, we will stay here for as long as it takes, and as many of our children have to die to achieve victory, and we never looked at that longitudinal kind of approach. How do you think things would have played out differently? How would have initiatives have gained more traction if we'd had kind of a harder conversation that this is going to be a long slog, but it probably wouldn't have been 20 years?
Well, I think McChrystal himself tells a story about how he talked to one of his subordinates and asked him that question: how would you fight differently if you were here until we're done? And the subordinate replies, well, I'd do everything differently. If you go in knowing you're there for a 9 to 12 month rotation, your primary goal is get through 9 to 12 months and survive. And so you have a risk aversion, and you do the things necessary to defeat the immediate threat in front of you and make it through 9 months or 12 months, right? But if you know you're actually there for the duration, for the commitment, well, then you actually are willing to accept some risk to go out and meet the tribal elder and have tea with him, and then go meet the guy who's the contractor who takes out the garbage, and have tea with him and learn what he needs to get his job done better. And then you go and help sweep the streets, and you go build the well, and you start to develop the longer term relationships necessary for victory in this kind of war. So the very knowledge that the troops and the diplomats and the intelligence professionals were there for just short-term rotations changed the incentive structure so they would not invest in the long term.
And would you agree that even times that may have been considered that they were cut off too short, the ALP program, for example, was started to great fanfare and then cut off very quickly after its inception?
By and large, that's right. And I want to acknowledge there were times when we tried, I would say we, individual policymakers here and there, and plans and programs tried to do the longer term approach. And sometimes they would last for 2 or 3 years, right? And then generally either the funding got cut, or the person rotated away, or the president changed, or something would end up pulling the plug.
So as these shorter term goals were set and attempted and tried, what do you think the American people's unrealistic goals of victory were? What do you think the conception of victory was that we probably didn't even define, but was outside of our reach? What would a realistic victory have looked like?
Yeah, I think I might challenge the way you're framing the question. I'm not sure the problem was that the American people had an unrealistic definition of victory. If anything, I think the American people's definition of victory was kill bin Laden, and keep me safe. And by the way, success, right? We got him, and there's been no other terrorist attacks. So by that measure, we did win, or we succeeded at that sort of low bar. And then Afghanistan collapsed and we left. So it's a different measure of success that I would say adds up to both a strategically and a morally defensible kind of success, in which we don't just kill bin Laden, we don't just keep ourselves safe, but we also deny terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan indefinitely, which we have failed to do, right? That we also degrade the global jihadist networks around the world, which we have failed to do. They're actually stronger now than I think that we've been in decades. We also maybe keep the Afghans safe and help them build an example of something that is a counterexample in the Islamic world that says, hey, look, even us here in the Islamic world, we can live this way too in a free society. And we succeeded at that for 20 years, and then we failed. So there's a variety of other measures of success we could have aimed at and had degrees of success at, and then ultimately failed.
So not meaning to sound like I'm down on the American people with that last question and then this one as well, but I do think that Americans tend to take concrete lessons, black and white lessons away from things. And we talked about it a little bit earlier. We should not try nation building. So, if you ask the average American, they might believe nation building is a bad idea, regime change is a bad idea, and they focus on the what rather than the how. And, you mentioned when the military adopted the coin strategy, when whole hog into coin, there was a lot of doing everything that we could as long as we could for as much as we could. And that probably led us into some distracting alleyways. What were some of the ways that you think adoption of coin enthusiastically was counterproductive, and what should it have been? What were the more appropriate ways that we should have adopted a coin approach?
Okay, good question. Let me just say, as a little side note or footnote for the scholars here, I do understand the difference between nation building and state building. And mostly of what I'm talking about in the book is actually state building, but I just call it nation building because that's the more popular term. So look at the footnotes. I do, I wrote my dissertation on state building. So in 2008, President Bush told us to do a strategy review. It was like the 4th out of 9, right? And this was my most sort of intense effort on policy development during the war. And General Lute was in charge of it, Doug Lute, the so-called war czar. And I and 5 other people in the team, we all pitched in to help produce this strategy review. And our conclusion at the time, I think we got this right, is that the conceptual center of gravity of U.S. efforts should be around counterinsurgency foremost. And everything else, counter-narcotics and counterterrorism and reconstruction stabilization, all should kind of flow under that and support it, with coin at the center. If we did that, it would have meant more police. It would have meant helping, with land disputes. It would have meant local order. Because when you have local order, you're crowding out space for the Taliban and thus for Al-Qaeda as well. And that's where you can actually talk about counter-narcotics without alienating the farmers, right? You gotta make sure they are consistent. It does mean that some things are a little bit less important, or you sequence them a bit later. Counter-narcotics might be a good example there. It was probably unhelpful to burn down poppy fields of poor farmers who had no other livelihood. Instead, we might have, for example, prioritized bombing the drug labs that were actually producing the heroin. That would be a more counterinsurgency appropriate form of counter-narcotics, right? So if you put coin first, it helps you think through the way to apply and implement and sequence the other policies so they're consistent with, not contradictory to, the main effort. Does that make sense?
It does. It reminds me of a quote from Admiral Olson. I think he gave as an aside. He said, when you adopt a counterinsurgent strategy, at some point in time, you have to actually counter the insurgents. All right. I'm going to ask kind of a big, broad, expansive question to cap off our portion before I open it up to questions from the audience. You have mentioned before that American foreign policy has to be grounded in our values, and balancing the approach between unrealistic utopianism and nihilism that leads to some dark alleyways. My question, looking backward and then looking forward, as a veteran yourself, as someone who poured a decade or more of your effort into it as a practitioner, and then again looking back on it as an academic, and now looking forward for what you hope for this country, what did it mean? What did the war in Afghanistan mean to the United States, to the world, and what has it framed us, or how has it framed us going forward for American foreign policy as we look to the future?
I think we haven't decided yet what it means. I think the meaning of a historical event is not really put in stone for even generations afterwards. I think the way we digest this war will affect what it means for us and for the Afghans in the future. That is part of why I wrote the book, because I want it to mean one set of things instead of another set of things. I don't want it to be a tale of defeatism and nihilism about how we are incapable of doing X, Y, or Z, and how we should not try to spread democracy, help the oppressed, defend ourselves, and so on and so forth. I think it should be a story of learning through failure to do this better if there's a next time, or simply to think better about our role in the world, no matter what the next time looks like. It may not. We're never going to have a war quite like this again, presumably, but we will have foreign policy challenges. We still do today. I think that if we take a counsel of despair from this war, that has profound consequences for Ukraine, for Iran, for Taiwan, for anywhere else, and that would be, in a sense, the ultimate defeat. It's important for us, I think, to not allow ourselves to defeat ourselves again by telling ourselves that narrative, but rather to learn through it so that we might be more well prepared for next time.
At this point in time, I'd like to open it up for new questions from the audience. So if anybody has anything that they'd like to ask Dr. Miller. Yes.
You mentioned that the war was undermined by the fact that it was 21-year wars as opposed to one 20-year war. My question is, to what extent is that sort of inevitable? So just by sort of the structure of the United States political system. So if you're President Obama in 2009, you can come in and say, well, this is our strategy, and this is going to be our strategy until the cows come home. But Mitt Romney may have feel differently, or whoever comes after. So is there a way in practical terms that you could have more continuity there?
I often hear the criticism that democracies are not capable of long-term foreign policy planning, and that sort of monarchies or aristocracies are somehow more well suited to it. And that's something that de Tocqueville addressed in Democracy in America, right? He thought that was true, that aristocracies and monarchies could plan better. Against that, I note that somehow we managed over 9 presidential administrations in 45 years to maintain a policy of containment against the Soviet Union. It was reasonably successful, with variation among those administrations and some failures in the middle, but nonetheless, it was broadly there was broad continuity and success there. And there's been some broad continuity in American foreign policy over the last 130 years in pursuing of both American power and American ideals. That's been the case from McKinley up until Obama, right? American power and American ideals. So I think there's broad continuity is possible. The changes in strategy in Afghanistan actually tended to happen within administrations more than between them, right? There's actually quite a lot of continuity between Bush in 07, 08 and Obama in 9 and 10. The real change comes when Obama says there's going to be a withdrawal timeline. That's something that he chose to do. There's also quite a lot of continuity between Obama in 2015-16 and Trump in 17-18. That's the era forever war, and they agreed with each other on what to do. Trump is not the one who changed that until 18 when he fired his whole team and went off on a different course. So there's more change, I think, within administrations than between them. So I think it's entirely possible. To take another example, I think there's actually been a lot of continuity on U.S. policy against China for the last 25 years, with some variants, but it's an example of where we have been, I think, rightly focused and concentrated on a singular goal of addressing the threat of a rising China. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you. And thanks for your very interesting explanations. I have a question as a German citizen, because this war, of course, it was lost. It's a big failure for the Western world, but it was a NATO mission as well. So we don't talk a lot about that. It was, as much as I know, the one and only Article 5 case for NATO. The partners, so the US asked for support. The Western partners did not hesitate to support the US and NATO. A lot of German citizens lost their lives. Couldn't we say, if we want to see something positive, and I'm not an expert in military strategy, that this war showed that NATO mechanisms worked and that the Western world at least could stick together? Well, the result was not positive, but the impact was positive. And we forget about that a lot.
Yeah, I think I applaud the sentiment of looking for a silver lining here and trying to find it in alliance solidarity. And NATO did stick it out for 20 years. I'll offer a slightly more measured take on that. Afghanistan showed some of the hard things that NATO has to address before it fights another war together. So while I served alongside the French guy there and a Kiwi there, New Zealander there, and so I was there in the tent with all the alliance partners, and we're all very grateful for that. Alliance cohesion proved to be quite difficult on the ground, and the ISAF commanders I interviewed complained about how they had an Italian chief of staff who didn't speak English, right, and how the Spanish contingent had caveats, limitations placed by their national parliament, were legally unable to actually go out on a mission. So these are things that the Afghanistan war surfaced that NATO is now seeking to address so that they are more well prepared next time we go to war together. So I'm glad that Afghanistan gave us that kind of almost trial run, so to speak. I hope that answers you. Yeah.
If you accept the kind of truism that those who don't know history are bound to repeat it, I'm curious, as we think about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to what extent were we aware of that history? And to what extent do you think we repeated it?
So Robert Jervis has a great take on this. He says those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, and those who remember history are doomed to make the opposite mistake. Right? I actually think that might be more accurate when it comes to the Russian invasion. If you read the Bush administration's memoirs, and this also came out across in the interviews, I interviewed Steve Hadley and Condi Rice and others, they invoked the Soviet analogy all the time. And the reference to the Soviet war and the Anglo-Afghan wars just peppers their memoirs. They're painfully aware that there's this history here, and that they don't want to repeat it. It was so cliched, it has a name, right? We want to avoid getting into the graveyard of empires, right? And I heard that so many times. There's 3 books by that title, at least, referencing Afghanistan. And it became almost frustrating because I think the policymakers clouded their own judgment by invoking this historical analogy so often. It took until 2009 until somebody said, Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense at the time, there's McChrystal, who said, look, it doesn't matter how big our army is, it matters what we do with it, right? We are not the Soviet Union. We are not carpet bombing villages. We're not dropping booby-trapped toys to blow kids' legs off. The Soviets did that, right? We are a different kind of army trying to wage a counterinsurgency, and the Afghans will not react to us the same way the Soviets, they reacted to the Soviets. So I think that the analogy was sometimes unhelpful for policymakers who were too self-limiting in envisioning what we might actually try to accomplish if we had intervened with maybe a heavier footprint earlier on. I think, by the way, we should have. I think in 2002, there should have been more American troops on the ground doing peacekeeping, not hunting al-Qaeda, just doing peacekeeping. Keep in mind, in 2002, the UN authorized the ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, and limited it to Kabul. There were no peacekeepers in the entirety of the country outside the capital. That is why you have a power vacuum. That's why you have criminal violence, warlord violence, drug violence that racks the country for 5 years, which is why the Taliban are able to walk back into power and say, look, if the government's not going to solve your problems, we will. And the Afghans were welcoming to that. So I think a heavier footprint, more peacekeepers earlier on might have actually been quite needful and quite necessary and quite welcomed by the Afghans.
Do you feel like, given our, we're the largest, strongest democracy, do we have a moral obligation to go in those instances, instead of just kind of overthrowing kind of Venezuela example, where we overthrow Maduro, we put somebody in that is more friendly to us ostensibly and that we can kind of influence, but there's not the chaos? Do you feel like that is a morally defensible pathway, and would that have worked out more effectively if we had just propped up a warlord in Afghanistan and said, hey, you're going to do our bidding, but we're not going to affect what you do there, which obviously would not have allowed for most likely women's rights and other things like that. So do we have a moral obligation to do nation building or state building?
And democratization, I think, is what you're also asking. Yeah. I don't know that I would say that we have a moral obligation in every instance always to use our power, thinking through using the just war language, right? You have to think about reasonable chance of success. And you don't have the reasonable chance of succeeding in democratization in every case all the time. And in some cases, I think a lighter kind of intervention like Venezuela might be the appropriate way to do it. So long as we're prepared, I think, over the long run to maybe put your thumb on the scale where possible to tilt the balance in favor of more accountable governance. It bothers me that in 1991, the United States liberated Kuwait and put the royal family back on the throne and didn't ask a single concession from them. It bothers me a little bit. I kind of think maybe we could have, and therefore should have, heavily suggested that this would be an appropriate time to allow a little bit more press freedom, a little bit more religious freedom. Like, that would have been an appropriate way to use our power in 1991, for example. Now, when it comes to Afghanistan, the point is kind of moot because we were not in the driver's seat. This is I think maybe a widespread misconception that we somehow forced or encouraged or pushed democracy on the Afghans. It's not true at all. There was a UN conference in December of 2001 where the Afghans met, and they said, look, we don't want to go back to civil war. The only thing we can agree on is to readopt our constitution from 1964, which was a democratic constitutional monarchy. And we're just going to change king to president. We're going to go with that for now. And then later on, they added an article on human rights. That was not something that we did. That was something that they decided and they pushed for, and they asked for help from the UN to make that happen and make it a reality. So in that case, there was kind of no conflict at all between our ideals and what the Afghans were asking for. Lots of stuff went wrong in Afghanistan. Democratization was not the driver of our failure. If anything, we should have done more to build the institutions to make democracy a reality there. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I took away from Afghanistan is that a lot of your perceptions as to where you're at on the ground are like a dozen different perceptions of what's happening. Just a couple anecdotes to get your responses. I was in Spin Boldak, which is a district within Kandahar province on the border. And I was out there was one time I was retired from the Marine Corps at the time. I was running a human terrain team, and uh, I was impressed by the fact that the women were all completely in burqa. 2010, 2011, every one of them, every one of them. So what kind of impression do I take away from that is, well, we're not bringing liberal democracy to Spin Boldak or Kandahar province anytime soon. The guy that ran the district was a guy named Razik. Okay. The famous Razik. Spent Marine Corps birthday ball with him. Now, Razik was an interesting character, but he wasn't a liberal Democrat, right? If he had a problem with he hated the Taliban, he had a problem with the Taliban, he'd take out his 9mm or 45 and shoot him in the head. Don Corleone, okay? That's what kept the peace in Spin Boldak, although nobody wanted to admit it. USAID didn't want to admit it, the State Department didn't want to admit it. The commanders who owned the territory didn't want to admit it, but he was our guy, okay? So that was why you had very low kinetic activity in Spin Boldak. He was responsible for standing up the border police. He was the border police commander at the time. Later took over Kandahar. First anecdote. The second anecdote that was my impression when I was back at ISAF headquarters in 2013, and I was reading reports about standing up the Afghan army. What I took away from that was we're not training maneuver force. You know, by that I mean, we weren't training an army, or they were incapable of conducting battalion level activity, probably not company level activity. This is 2013, right? And yet that wasn't what we were hearing from the leadership of ISAF, and certainly not back in Washington. So I don't know what to make of that, except to say, could you comment on that? That sort of gets at can we do a long-term counterinsurgency strategy when we have to deal with La Cosa Nostra in Kandahar, and we can't even stand up an Afghan National Army that can fight. They're the ones that should be fighting the insurgency. So after 11 years, we haven't created an Afghan military that can do, really anything.
Oh, a lot there. Yeah. Excuse me. So what you're asking about is sort of the warlord problem. We overthrow the Taliban, and who's there? Who's left standing? Well, it's the Northern Alliance, our allies, who are really just a bunch of warlords, guys with guns and militias, who are expecting a share of the spoils. This is actually a pretty common problem in post-conflict societies around the world. What do you do? How do you move to a kind of a functioning civil society when what you have is a bunch of guys with guns, big men with guns? A lot of societies will just pass a blanket amnesty and say, all right, we're going to forgive everything that happened in the past, put down your guns, put on suits, and we'll go forward, right? That's more or less what the Karzai government was trying to do with the warlords, was kind of a wink and a nod, sweep things under the rug, and say, put on a suit and tie, and we'll give you a title as a governor, as a minister, or whatnot. And that is a pretty or make them a border police commander like Razik, right? He was a thug and a warlord and a real bad dude, but he was our bad dude, right? Yeah, this goes back to FDR's quip, you've all heard, right, about Somoza in Nicaragua. He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, right? There's a long tradition in American foreign policy of finding a tough guy to be our agent on the ground, essentially, to pursue our interests. And it's a very successful short-term strategy. It works in the short term. Razik kept the peace until Razik was killed in 2018, I believe, right? And yeah, and then it all falls apart, because when our SOB beats his grave, right, then we have no strategy left. And the purpose of I think the warlord strategy was try to co-opt these guys in the short term while you build the institutions underneath them for the long term, which we did not do. That is what we underinvested in doing. We just kept on leaning on those warlords here, there, everywhere until time ran out and we never had any institutions left. I around 2007 had dinner with Golag Ashurzai, one of the warlords at the time. He was governor of Nangarhar province. and he entertained me over dinner in his palace, and spent an hour and a half trying to persuade me that we would solve all of Afghanistan's problems if we just handed the country back to the Barakzai tribe. Guess which tribe he belonged to? Right. So that was his preferred solution, of course. But would that be a long-term solution that protected our interests in the long run? Of course not. Of course not. So you have to marry the short and the long run together. You got to lean on the warlords a little bit, but then have a longer-term solution, which is what we did not have.
Hi, Dr. Miller. I want to pull that thread a little bit about institution building, right? How do you invest in institutions in a low trust society, in a, with tribal loyalties, various ethnicities and religions? And how much did American and Western blindness of just like, we have a police force that works, right? We have institutions that seem to function, and this becomes something that we just sort of, take for granted. You know, is there a way to do institution building that is credible, that is sustainable? And if so, why did we fail?
So it's a good question, and you're right that it was a low trust society. But I do want to clarify that it was low trust because it was post-conflict, not because it was non-Western or poor or Muslim or any of those things, right? You can have a high trust society with functioning institutions with all kinds of culturally different backgrounds. And Afghanistan itself was a largely functioning post-colonial developing society from the 1930s to the 1970s. It was a pretty normal, poor developing country with a functioning parliament, with a functioning monarchy, with a functioning district offices that built irrigation canals. Like, it actually worked. Afghanistan has not been for thousands of years a misery of drug trafficking and terrorist networks and all that kind of stuff. So the main problem is you're emerging from conflict, not just the Taliban, but there was a prior civil war, there's a Soviet invasion, and so the country was absolutely devastated. In other post-conflict societies, the answer has been you insert a third party, a credible third party, as a mediator and an intervening force, a peacekeeping force that kind of holds the ring and says, look, we will provide order for a time, a temporary season, so that everybody can calm down, put your guns down, start to talk again together, and start to learn to trust each other. And we, the third party, will try to help restart a political dialogue, and then we can step back and you can get back together again. That was called the bond process, and it was succeeding in stages for those first 5-6 years. We had elections, we had a new parliament, we had a elected president, and we had a very strongly growing Afghan economy in those early years. And we had institutions like the Ministry of Finance was making great strides, right? So I'm trying to highlight that the ultimate failure was not inevitable. There was real, genuine progress. And it stalls out because the third party did not deploy enough force. We didn't hold enough of the ground. There was still insecurity in the provinces, and people gradually lost faith in the effort, and they began to distrust each other and pull back, and then the Taliban came back in. Yeah. So institutions, entirely possible. There's examples of success, like the Ministry of Finance.
I think we had a question over here.
Thank you for your talk. My question is on state building. What would be a good example that you would cite of a successful state building operation in, I'd say, recent modern history? And specifically, what are some of the key takeaways that we should take from that going forward?
I have a PhD institution for you. Good question. Yeah. So after the Cold War, the U.S. and the UN launched all kinds of interventions. And there's a misconception that we got them all wrong, or that because anybody old enough in the room will remember Somalia. And that became the kind of the byword for failed intervention. And there's a belief that was paradigmatic of how interventions go. That's not true at all. In the post-Cold War era, there was a lot of interventions like in Mozambique and in Nicaragua and in Namibia and Bosnia and Kosovo all cited successes as well. Second intervention in Liberia, the British intervention in Sierra Leone, these and East Timor, these all had measures of success. And I do want to say measures because to me the success is really to change the trajectory so that a society can begin its own process of putting itself together. The intervener can never do it all. We shouldn't try that. We should simply try to come in, halt the violence, restart the process so that there can be a trajectory going forward. And in every one of those that I mentioned, that trajectory took hold and held it for another decade or two after that. And that's as good of a success as we can hope for. The Brahimi report looked at state building and peacekeeping operations in the 90s and concluded that, we've made some mistakes. We are learning. We are getting better. Here's how to do better. They called for more resources, better rules of engagement, more authorities on the ground, things like that. So the international community was getting better at these kind of interventions up until 2001, and then by 2013 we sort of lost faith in it. Yep.
I think we have time for one more. If there's
Actually,
sorry about
anything you want to say or add? I just want to recognize your own expertise here. Yeah.
Wonderful. Right. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
I think we have a question right over here.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question is concerning kind of the lessons for after the war. You had mentioned at the end of your guys' discussion that there's a wrong set of lessons to take away to guide American foreign policy, and that would have disaster effects in places like Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan. So my question, and it's also connected to the discussion of America's commitment abroad, is how do you make the case to the American people that have shown increasing disinterest in sustained commitment abroad that this is the right thing to do for American interests, whether that be strategically or morally?
So I think from Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of the American people internalized, this is the cost of intervention. Let's not do that. I think quite a lot of subsequent history has shown us the cost of not intervening. And that cost is also substantial. And that cost looks like Syria, for example. And that cost may look like Ukraine if indeed we completely pull back our support there. And that cost might look like a Chinese takeover of Taiwan if we choose not to be involved in there in some form or fashion. This gets to a broader conversation about America's role in the world broadly. You'll not be surprised from my comments that I think that our grand strategy should center around investing in a culture of ordered liberty within and among nations, because that broader culture of a free world is the outer perimeter of our security, and it is the engine of our prosperity, and it's a tool of our influence. So it really is a good way to serve America's interests by making our interests consonant with the interests of the broader community, broader family of nations. That, I think, should be American grand strategy in a nutshell. And and I fear that that people look at Afghanistan and Iraq and say, let's not go that direction at all. And my response is to say, no. This means it's even more urgent that we learn how to do this right. Otherwise, a much larger thing is going to unravel around us, as I fear it may be unraveling.
Dr. Miller, I would just like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for this great conversation. And I would like to thank you on my own part as a veteran of this war. This is an important conversation so that, as you point out, we can take hope from our defeat rather than look at it in a defeatist way. So thank you very much, Dr. Miller, and thank you for everyone for attending.